Today on Fixity Fix, part 2 of our series on the electrification of this 1984 Porsche 944. Today we'll be removing the battery pack from the donor car, a salvaged 2016 Tesla Model S. Stay tuned to see how we did it.
Fixity Fix!
In part 1, we went over where we're sourcing the parts. As much as I know you want to see more shots of this beautiful Porsche, this video is going to focus on the process we came up with for removing the battery pack from the Tesla Model S. Under the hood on the front right is the first responder loop, and it can be disconnected using this quick connect here. Press in and pull. And now the high voltage system is disabled. There's still high voltage on the battery and the battery terminals, but there should be nothing going to the motors or the rest of the car other than 12 volts. As an additional safety measure, we're going to unhook the 12 volt battery. The 12 volt battery closes a relay which allows the full 400 volts to flow around the car. First responder loop defeats that, but we're going to be extra careful and go ahead and pull out this 12 volt battery too. After a little 10 millimeter magic, this 12 volt battery is disconnected. Our pinch weld dollies, 4 of them, are underneath the Tesla now. We'll unbolt a whole bunch of different e-Torx bolts and bigger bolts to drop the battery pack onto these and then lift the entire Tesla off of the battery pack. It's a good idea before putting this thing up on the lift to remove parts to get it into tow mode, which takes it out of park and takes off the e-brake. This thing smells like an Uber. Can you picture that? It's got the whole garage smelling like an Uber. To get it into tow mode, you gotta have the key in the car, and at least the 12 volt has to be hooked up. And this key fob, even with the new battery, is not working too well, so we have to put it down here for the car to recognize it, waiting for it to boot up. All right, foot on the brake. Go into, I think, safety, service, and then tow mode. Not working. All right, I think maybe put it into park. There we go. All right, now tow mode. Then we're going to turn off the car. So we're in tow mode now, so the wheels will be able to turn and the front and rear transaxles will be able to turn just fine, so we can get at all the bolts to remove anything we need to remove. Let's crawl down under the car. We'll take off this panel by pulling out these plastic pins. This will expose more bolts. Then we'll remove all of these e-Torx bolts. And then finally, there are recessed structural bolts holding in the battery pack that will come out. Interestingly, this battery pack fits inside the frame so snugly that only one of these structural bolts will hold the whole pack in, as it's going to be bolstered by the sides of the frame. So we'll get it down to one bolt on this side and then start removing that bolt. The battery pack will drop onto our wheel dollies. Of course, we'll be much closer to the ground when we perform that step. Good idea to have one of these panel clip removers. It makes jobs like this so much easier on modern cars. Now you can see these bolts holding things in. It appears that there's 54 of these e-Torx bolts in the bottom, and it appears there are 20 bolts, structural bolts, holding the pack in. Under the front part of this battery pack, we've got this aluminum skid plate piece that's held in by 2 bolts. That looks like it's going to need to come off to let the pack out. Here on the front, underneath the interfering aluminum skid shield, were 4 of these 13mm bolts holding the front lip of the battery pack in. Just removed all 4 of those. Under the back, just in front of the rear axle, on each side of the car is this plate. And it appears that at least this bolt on each side has to come out for the pack to be able to drop free, in addition to the structural bolts that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to check and make sure I didn't miss any of these wonderful little E-Torx bolts, because it's going to be hard to get at those once the pack is out of the car and resting on top of a stand. Next, underneath the car, from back to front, just making sure everything has been taken off that's going to interfere with the battery pack dropping. Once we remove all of the centering bolts and rail bolts, I'm going to make my way around the whole edge of it and just make sure nothing is impeding the drop. On the back of the battery pack, there are a couple of Torx bolts holding in the tail section of the battery pack to the rear of the frame. I've taken those out. Under the right hand or passenger side front is this panel held in by Torx Plus 5-point bolts. Those are typically used, I believe, in high voltage situations. So I'm going to pull this panel off using one of those 5-point Torx Plus sockets, and then I'm going to put on my high voltage gloves. And you really shouldn't be going into these battery packs without very specific high voltage gloves. I'll show you the kind. I'm using Novak Class 0 gloves here that protect you up to 1,000 volts. They absolutely have to be in airtight, good condition to work, and you also have to cover them with a good leather glove to keep them from being punctured while you're working on high voltage stuff. To make sure that they're intact, you just start rolling at the base, and if they hold air, they hold air without leaks, so these pass the test. Have to do this every time before you do a project. If they don't hold air and they leak, you need to get a new pair. Also check the expiration date on the glove and make sure that they are still within spec. I've already opened the contactors by pulling out the first responder loop and disconnecting the 12-volt battery. I'm going to use a known good DC meter. I've already tested it on a known good battery to make sure it's reading correctly. Let's see what kind of voltage is being read in here. Don't put your face directly under it. The contactors, being out, have disabled power through this. Insulated lineman's pliers to be safe. And that is the pyro fuse out, which, if the contactors were not off for some reason, this will still half the voltage, because you've got about 200 volts longitudinally down one side and another 200 down the other. I make double sure I don't have any voltage in here now that I can touch the actual contacts. Yeah, I'm getting about 20 volts here, probably from one of the packs. To be safe, I'm going to go ahead and cover up these contacts just in case anything goes wrong, since I'm using metal stands to wheel around this battery pack once I drop the pack. At this point, on each side of the car here, we have 8 13mm bolts and 10 of these external Torx bolts that are recessed. The 13 millimeter bolts hold the battery pack to the side rails of the frame. The Torx bolts hold the battery pack to the center of the frame. There are a couple of the external Torx bolts near the front too. I'm going to take out all of the Torx bolts first, and then I'll take out all but 2 on each side of the 13 millimeter bolts. So I'm going to leave 4 of these 13 millimeter bolts holding the battery pack into the Tesla, and then I'm going to lower the lift so that the battery pack is resting on adequate support. In this case, 4 of these Harbor Freight pinch rail dollies. At that point, I'll remove the final 4 bolts holding the battery pack in, and then lift the car off of the battery pack and then roll the battery pack out from underneath the car. These are E12 Torx bolts holding into the center frame rails. Careful not to drop them on your face or your phone. We're zipping out the E-Torx here on the front of the pack. The second of the front recessed torque bolts. At this point, I've only got 4 bolts holding the battery pack into the Tesla. There are 2 on each side. I have the center 13 millimeter bolts still in. Now we should be able to lift up the body around the battery, and the battery will sit on the wheels. I hope. It worked. Now I just need to roll the battery out from under the car. Hopefully I have enough clearance to do that. We'll see.
Looks about like that battery.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty interesting. And you can see the male end of the contactors going in to power the motors. It sounds so hollow. Frame right there, and some frame members going across in the middle. And then the pillars between the front and rear doors are also heavily reinforced. Very different type of frame than what we've been used to in this shop. Mm-hmm. Thanks for joining us on Fixity Fix. Be sure to tune in for episode 3, where we cover removing the 16 battery modules from that hermetically sealed battery pack we just took out. If you found this content helpful, please consider giving it a like. Even think about subscribing to Fixity Fix and hitting that little bell so that you'll get notified when a new video drops. We'll see you next time. Explain the little rolly things to the world.
They go under a car
Mm-hmm.
at the jack point.
Yeah, that's right.
And you can let something rest on them, pull the frame off of whatever's resting on them with a lift, and then roll whatever you took out to the other side of the garage. In this case, a battery pack.
Yeah. I love the long jack interface surfaces here. Made me feel pretty comfortable and confident putting 4 of these things under this battery pack. Seems to have supported it well. The battery pack was a little bit, it seemed like it was either a little twisty, or one of the jack stands more likely was a slightly different height. And I was rolling it, and I didn't realize it, but I was rolling it at one point pretty much on a tripod. So I had to put a jack under one corner and jack it up and then let it back down onto this thing just to make sure it's super sturdy while I disassemble this thing. But these worked great. If they were a little higher, that would be a little bit better for the disassembly, which is going to take a lot of force and hard work. But I'll just have to sit while I do it. I could also have stacked up some 6x6s or 8x8s under it and had it a little higher, but I was just ready to get it out.